After 15 years without a word from my father, he called on a Thursday afternoon and the first thing he said was, "I have someone I want you to meet." Let me take you back to the beginning, because this story didn't start with a phone call. It started on a Sunday morning when I was 15 years old and my father sat down at our kitchen table and told my mother and me that he was leaving. Not leaving for work, not leaving for a few days. Just leaving. He had met someone, he said. Someone younger, someone who made him feel things he hadn't felt in a long time, and he needed to follow that. I remember my mother's face going very still, the way faces go still when the body decides that moving anything might cause it to break. I remember the coffee getting cold on the table between them. And I remember thinking, with the particular clarity that 15-year-olds sometimes have, that whatever happened next, nothing was ever going to feel the same. My name is Grace and my father's name is Robert, and for 15 years he was simply absent. Not partially absent, not occasionally present, completely gone. No birthday calls, no Christmas cards, no accidental run-ins at family events because he stopped attending family events. He moved across the city with the woman he had left us for, a woman named Diane who was 12 years younger than my mother and who I met exactly once, briefly, before the door of that new life closed completely and my mother and I were left on the other side of it. My mother's name is Linda and she is one of the strongest people I have ever known. Not because she was dramatic about her strength but because she wasn't. She went back to work full-time within 3 months of my father leaving. She learned to fix things around the house that she had always left to him. She came to every school event, every graduation, every small and large milestone of my life with a presence that was so consistent and so complete that I sometimes forgot, for stretches of time, that there was supposed to be someone else there too. But I didn't forget entirely. Nobody forgets entirely. I thought about my father in the quiet ways that absent parents occupy space, not constantly, not dramatically, but in the margins of ordinary moments. When friends talked about their fathers at school. When I walked down the aisle at my cousin's wedding and watched her father cry. When I turned 30 and sat with the particular weight of a milestone birthday and thought about who was and wasn't there to mark it with me. He was always somewhere in the background of those moments, not as a presence but as a specific kind of absence, the kind that has a shape to it. I had his number in my phone. I don't know why exactly, I had updated it once years ago, when a mutual relative passed it along, and I had added it and then never used it and never deleted it either. It just sat there, this number attached to a name, like a door I wasn't ready to open and wasn't ready to close. And then on a Thursday afternoon in March I was sitting at my desk at work, halfway through a report that I wasn't particularly interested in, and my phone rang. I looked at the screen. And there was his name, Robert, just sitting there on my screen like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. I stared at it for a long time. Long enough that most people would have let it go to voicemail, and I almost did, 3 times. But something, I still can't fully explain what, made me pick up. I said hello. There was a pause on the other end, just long enough to tell me he hadn't been completely certain I would answer either. And then he said my name. Grace. Just my name, the way he used to say it when I was small and he was calling me for dinner, and something in my chest did a thing I wasn't prepared for. He said he knew this was a shock and that he had no right to call without warning and that he would understand if I hung up. And then he said, "I have someone I want you to meet." I didn't hang up. I asked him who. He told me about Sophie. Sophie was 13 years old. She was his daughter, his and Diane's, born 2 years after he left us and about 6 months before Diane left him. Diane had met someone else, he said, and she had left quickly and cleanly in the way that people leave when they have already emotionally departed long before the physical exit. She had not taken Sophie with her. Sophie had grown up with Robert, just the two of them, in the apartment across the city that I had never visited and never wanted to. I sat at my desk with the phone against my ear and processed what he was telling me. I had a sister. A 13-year-old sister who had grown up without her mother the way I had grown up without my father, and who apparently knew I existed and had been asking about me, and whose father had finally gathered whatever it was he needed to gather to make this call. I told him I needed time to think. He said of course. He said he was sorry, that word arriving at the end of the conversation like something he had been working up to the entire time. I said I heard him. And then I ended the call and sat very still at my desk for about 10 minutes before I picked up my phone again and called my mother. My mother picked up on the second ring, the way she always does, like she has been quietly ready for whatever comes next her entire life. I told her everything, the call, Robert's voice, Sophie, all of it, and she listened without interrupting, which is one of the things about my mother that I have always loved most. When I finished she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "How do you feel?" I said I didn't know yet. She said that was a reasonable answer. I asked her what she thought I should do. She said that was not her decision to make but that she would tell me one thing. A 13-year-old girl who grew up without her mother had done nothing wrong and deserved nothing less than a chance. She didn't say anything else about Robert. She didn't need to. I spent 3 days thinking. I went through every version of the decision, the anger of 15 years of silence, the birthdays he had missed, the milestones he had not shown up for, the specific and accumulated weight of growing up knowing your father had chosen something else over you. I sat with all of that and I didn't minimize it and I didn't rush past it. It was real and it was mine and I gave it the space it deserved. And then I thought about Sophie. 13 years old. No mother, a father who was trying, a half-sister somewhere across the city who she apparently knew existed and wondered about. I had spent years wondering what it would have been like to have a sister. I had been an only child in a house that was quieter than it should have been and I had felt that absence in the particular way that you feel the absence of something you never had but somehow knew you were missing. I called Robert back on the 4th day. I told him I was willing to meet Sophie. I told him I was not promising anything beyond that first meeting and that I needed him to understand the difference between giving this a chance and having already forgiven everything. He said he understood. He said thank you in a way that told me he had not been certain I would call back. We agreed to meet at a cafe on a Saturday morning, neutral ground, somewhere public and low pressure. I arrived first and sat at a corner table with a coffee I was too nervous to drink and waited. And then the door opened and Robert walked in and behind him was a girl with dark hair and his exact jaw line and something in her eyes that I recognized without being able to immediately name. She was nervous. I could see it in the way she held herself, slightly pulled in, watching me carefully before deciding what to do with what she saw. Robert introduced us, Grace, Sophie, Grace, and then stepped back in a way that told me he understood this moment was not about him. Sophie sat down across from me and looked at me directly and said, "You look like the photo Dad has of you. From your graduation." I said, "He has a photo from my graduation?" She said yes, that he kept it on his desk and had for as long as she could remember. I didn't know what to do with that information so I set it aside and focused on her, because she was what I had come for. We talked for 2 hours. She was funny in a dry, understated way that caught me off guard. She was reading 3 books at the same time and had strong opinions about all of them. She asked me questions about my work and my life with the directness of someone who had learned to get information efficiently because she had grown up in a quiet house and had to make the most of the conversations available to her. At some point Robert excused himself to get more coffee and Sophie leaned across the table slightly and said, "I've wanted to meet you for a really long time." I said I had wanted a sister for a really long time. She looked at me for a moment and then nodded like something had been confirmed. After the cafe Robert walked us to the parking lot and we stood in the thin March sunlight and he looked at me and said, "I know I don't deserve this." I said, "No, you don't. But she does." He nodded. He didn't try to say more than that and I was grateful for it because more would have been too much for that particular afternoon. I called my mother from the car. I told her about Sophie, the dry humor, the 3 books, the photo on Robert's desk. My mother listened and I could hear her smiling through the phone. She said, "Bring her to dinner sometime." Just like that, simple and open, the way my mother approaches most things that matter. The months that followed were not without difficulty. Robert and I had conversations that were uncomfortable and necessary, the kind where old wounds get acknowledged without being fully healed, where you say things that have been waiting 15 years to be said and the other person has to sit with them. He did not make excuses and I did not pretend the years hadn't happened, and somewhere in that honesty we found a version of a relationship that was different from what we had before he left but was genuinely something rather than nothing. Sophie started coming to my apartment on Saturday afternoons. We cooked badly and watched movies, and she told me about her friends and her complicated feelings about school, and I told her about my work and my life and the city that she was only now beginning to explore properly. She met my mother at dinner 6 weeks after the cafe, and my mother treated her with the same warmth she treated everyone she decided to care about, which was immediately and completely. At that dinner Sophie helped my mother clear the plates without being asked, and my mother said, "You're welcome here anytime, you know that." Sophie said, "I know. Grace told me." And then she looked at me across the table with that direct look of hers and said, "She talks about you a lot." My mother looked at me and raised an eyebrow and said, "Does she?" I said, "You're my favorite topic." My mother laughed and Sophie laughed, and Robert, who was sitting quietly at the end of the table in the careful way of someone who knows he is a guest in a warmth he did not build, smiled at his plate. After dinner he helped wash up without being asked. At the door he put on his coat and looked at my mother and said, "Thank you for having us, Linda." My mother said, "Thank you for calling her, Robert." Neither of them said anything else, and neither of them needed to. I walked Sophie to Robert's car and she hugged me at the door, quickly, the way teenagers hug when they mean it but don't want to make a whole thing of it. I hugged her back and said I would see her Saturday. She said obviously, as if there had never been any question, and got in the car. I stood on the sidewalk and watched them drive away, and then I went back inside and helped my mother with the last of the dishes. She handed me a towel and said, "She's wonderful." I said, "I know."